So this is our second snippet, which is going to look at the economic downturn of the mid 1970s and its political impact. And this starts with the oil crisis of 1973. U.S. economy had become increasingly reliant on cars. The assumption was that gas prices would remain always cheap, and for the large amount they were in the 50s and 60s into the early 70s. And then suddenly in 1973, in the aftermath of the Arab-Israeli War, where the United States had backed Israel, the Arab states pressured an organization called OPEC, which is still around, it's less powerful now, to restrict oil sales to the United States. And the result was basic principle of supply and demand. If demand remains constant and supply goes dramatically down, the result would be that the price of gas would skyrocket, which is what happens in 1973 and 74. Especially, and you kind of see it from this photo, American cars tended not to be well structured in terms of efficient gas mileage. And the result was a wave of inflation that spread throughout the economy, 8.8% in 1973, peaking at 12.2% in 1974. And inflation as a political issue in particular affects working class and middle class voters. Working class voters, for instance, who were in a union might have negotiated a union contract with a 2 or 3 or 4% guaranteed wage increase. But if your prices are increasing by 12% and your pay is only increasing by 4%, in effect, you're less wealthy. And inflation especially affects retirees. Let's say you're on a pension. The pension has a cost of living allowance that goes up 2 or 3% a year, but inflation again goes up by 12%. And the president, Gerald Ford, who was, I think, really was a genuinely honest and a decent man, had chosen to pardon Nixon after Nixon left office to try to move the country beyond Watergate, but was an unelected president and seemed overmatched by what was going on. You'll notice the button that he's wearing in this photo, WIN. That was an acronym that stood for Whip Inflation Now, which basically summarized the administration's program in terms of dealing with inflation. It didn't know what it was doing. In the end, inflation kind of tapers off as oil trickles back into the system. The boycott ends around a year in 75 and 76. But as we'll see in the late 70s, this causes a significant problem. And in general, the economy isn't doing well in the mid 70s. The sense among the Democrats is that it's likely that whoever the Democrats nominate is going to be elected president. The question is, who are they going to nominate? In January of 1976, the front runners are Hubert Humphrey, George Wallace, Ed Muskie, and George McGovern. So Humphrey, we've seen before, the nominee in 68. McGovern, remember, was the nominee in 72. Muskie was the front runner in 72, and George Wallace is this segregationist candidate who's kind of reinventing himself as a right-wing populist. Remarkably, all four of these candidates, although they are the nominal frontrunners, choose not to run in 1976. So this would be sort of the equivalent in 2020 if sometime in late January, early February, Biden, Sanders, Bloomberg, and Warren all decided that they weren't going to run. So it creates this vacuum. And into the vacuum comes this obscure one-term governor of Georgia named Jimmy Carter, who had spent an extraordinary amount of time, very smartly, it turns out, in 1975 and 1976 in Iowa, which had shifted its caucus from late spring to late winter and shot ahead of New Hampshire in the line. So this is the first year where the Iowa caucuses start to emerge. Carter comes in first among the candidates, although second overall. There's an uncommitted slate because all these candidates have dropped out. That runs ahead of him, but he's the leading candidate out of Iowa, gets momentum and becomes the leading candidate, wins the New Hampshire primary, and as you can see, jumps up in the national polls. His major challenger is probably Scoop Jackson at this stage, a Washington senator, pro-war, but liberal on economic issues. Carter is a tough one to characterize. He was a peanut farmer before entering politics. So his unofficial mascot becomes this peanut with the big smile, because he'd always be smiling. And he runs on this vague platform of ethics and good government and integrity. He says he won't lie to the American people. He'll be honest. It's very much a post-Watergate campaign, but it fits into this new Democratic Party. He doesn't talk a lot about economic issues. And in fact, his economic agenda is extremely vague. And you can get a sense of it from this TV ad, which is from the Carter 76 campaign. And as you listen to this, just sort of ask yourself, where are the specifics in terms of what actual policies he was going to adopt.
We've seen walls built around Washington, and we feel like we can't quite get through to guarantee the people of this country a government that's sensitive to our needs, that we can understand and control, that's competent, well-managed, efficient, economical, purposeful, and also a government of which we can be proud.
Jimmy Carter, a leader for a change.
Again, these are nice words, but there's nothing in general in terms of where he wanted to go. And it turns out that Carter is a moderate, even a conservative Democrat on lots of economic issues, and is out of step with Democratic orthodoxy on a number of matters. But he sweeps to the early lead in the primaries, and his other challengers wait too long to get in. Humphrey is considering the idea of jumping in, but Humphrey, it turns out, has a terminal illness and will pass away in 1978. Carter very narrowly defeats this interesting congressman from Arizona named Mo Udall in the New Hampshire and Wisconsin primaries. If Udall had won those primaries, Udall probably would have been president. Jerry Brown at this point is a young governor of California. Brown just left office in 2018 as a quite old governor of California. He's young and dynamic, but he waits too long to get in. Ted Kennedy shows no interest in running. Probably the strongest challenger to Carter would have been Frank Church, a senator from Idaho, who had shot to national prominence in the mid-70s, overseeing a Senate investigation of improprieties by the CIA. But Church decides to stay forward with his investigation and doesn't get into the race for the presidency until it's far too late to meaningfully challenge Carter. So the net result of the 76 primaries is that Carter wins all of these bright yellow states. And in this new Democratic environment where the party leaders have less power, the fact that most prominent Democratic office holders don't endorse Carter really makes it almost irrelevant. And even though he loses almost all of the late primaries, in 76, the later primaries tended to be out west and also in New Jersey where Carter lost, kind of limps into the convention and nonetheless prevails. Meanwhile, among the Republican side, for the first time, the primaries are decisive. Gerald Ford wins most of the early primaries. It looks as if he's going to easily put away a challenger on his right, former California Governor Ronald Reagan. And then Reagan makes a last stand in North Carolina, where he's aided by this ex-segregationist segregationist Republican, Jesse Helms, who would become North Carolina's first popularly elected Republican senator in 1972. Helms throws his political machine behind Reagan. Reagan wins the primary, sweeps through the late primaries, and the result is an almost even tie between Reagan and Ford in the Republican Party approach. Reagan won the states that are in red on this map. Ford won the states that were in blue. Reagan tries to broaden his appeal. The impression of Reagan at this time was that he was too conservative to win. He tries to broaden his appeal by naming a Pennsylvania senator named Dick Schweiker as his running mate. Schweiker would have been the first Jewish running mate if Reagan had been nominated. But it winds up weakening his coalition because Schweiker was a fairly liberal Republican, and a couple of southern states, Mississippi and Florida, choose to go with Ford, and that's enough to put Ford over the top. Ford starts the race around 30 points behind Carter, but increasingly there's this sense that there's just no there with Carter. The nomination becomes much closer as we move along. Carter does this infamous interview with Playboy, and he's asked, he says he's going to be honest, and so he says that he's had lust in his heart with looking at other women, and what he thinks this will show is how he's an honest person. Instead, he sort of comes across as ridiculous. And his lead starts to drop to around 10 points by the end of September, to around 5 points in the middle of October. And in the final Gallup poll, which is taken in the 76 campaign, he's actually fallen a point behind Gerald Ford. But what turns out to be decisive is a debate. The impression with Ford is that he was, while a nice man, overmatched as president and not particularly intelligent. And he commits a debate faux pas when he is asked about this really innocuous document called the Helsinki Accords, which recognized the boundaries of post-war Europe, but to try to show that he was not too accommodating to the Soviet Union, he made this bizarre claim that Poland wasn't in the Soviet bloc. It came out at the worst time, very late in the campaign. And Carter, in the end, wins by a very narrow margin. This is a map I can almost reassure you we will never see again in a presidential election. The Democrats sweeping the South and a handful of states in the Midwest and the Northeast, including Ohio. But losing all of the West except for Hawaii, and Carter is elected. The question is what's going to occur to him. And the third snippet that we have, we'll take a look at the Carter administration.